The UNSC scout ship Pathfinder drifted silently through the darkness of uncharted space. Its sleek hull reflected the distant starlight as it approached a planet that wasn't supposed to exist. According to all charts, this section of the Orion Arm should have been empty. Instead, sensors detected a blue-green world with unusual radiation patterns that made the science team buzz with excitement. "Orbit achieved, Captain," announced the pilot, her fingers dancing across the control panel. Captain Thorne nodded. "Begin planetary scans and prepare the landing team." James Reed stood at the observation window, studying the planet below. As the Pathfinder's lead science officer, he had seen many worlds, but something about this one made his heart beat faster. The scanner in his hand beeped with readings that made no sense, energy signatures unlike anything in the UNSC database. "You're going down there, aren't you?" asked Mike, the ship's medical officer. James smiled. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." 3 hours later, James led a team of 5 explorers toward the planet's surface in a small shuttle. The descent was smooth until they hit the atmosphere, where strange wind patterns tossed them like a leaf. "Hold on," shouted the pilot as he fought the controls. The shuttle landed harder than planned in a clearing surrounded by tall, silver-leaved trees. James was the first to step outside, his boots sinking slightly into the soft purple moss that covered the ground. "Air is breathable, but has higher oxygen content than Earth," he reported after checking his instruments. "Temperature is 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Gravity slightly less than Earth standard." The team spread out, collecting samples and taking readings. The forest around them hummed with life. Small flying creatures darted between trees, and something that looked like a 6-legged deer watched them from a distance. "Reed, you need to see this," called Tom, the team's biologist. James approached a large tree where Tom pointed to deep gouges in the trunk, claw marks that stretched nearly 7 feet high. "Whatever made these is big," Tom whispered. "Really big." James nodded, excitement mingling with caution. "Let's stay alert and stick together." But the team's plans changed when the ground beneath them suddenly shook. What started as a small tremor quickly became a violent earthquake that split the forest floor. James lost his footing as the earth opened between him and the others. "Fall back to the shuttle," he yelled as he tumbled down a slope of loose soil and rocks. By the time the shaking stopped, James found himself alone in a ravine, his communicator damaged and his leg bleeding from a deep cut. Night was falling quickly, bringing strange sounds from the forest. Using his survival training, James found shelter in a small cave and treated his wound. He tried to repair his communicator but couldn't get a signal through the mineral-rich rocks above. "Guess I'm spending the night," he muttered to himself, setting up emergency lights. The strange sounds grew closer as darkness fell completely. James gripped his sidearm, watching the cave entrance. Something was out there, moving through the trees. Something big. Then he saw it. A massive shape blocking the moonlight at the cave entrance. It was at least 9 feet tall, with a powerful reptilian body covered in dark scales that seemed to absorb light. Its head was long and crowned with bony ridges, and its eyes glowed with golden intelligence. 4 arms ended in claws that matched the marks on the tree, and a long tail swept behind it. James aimed his weapon, knowing it would probably do little good. The creature, a predator unlike any he had ever seen, tilted its head and studied him. It made no move to attack. For what felt like hours, they watched each other in silence. Then, unexpectedly, the creature backed away and disappeared into the night, leaving James wondering why he was still alive. James woke to the sound of something heavy being dropped near his feet. Opening his eyes, he found himself staring at the massive predator from the night before. In front of him lay a small animal, freshly killed. "Are you bringing me food?" James whispered, barely believing what he was seeing. The creature tilted its head again, those golden eyes studying him with what seemed like curiosity. Its scales shimmered in the morning light, revealing patterns of bioluminescent blue that had been invisible in the darkness. After several cautious minutes, James reached for the animal. The predator made no move to stop him. Using his survival knife, James cleaned and cooked the meat over a small fire. All the while, the creature watched from just outside the cave. "I should call you something," James said, finding comfort in talking aloud. "How about Midnight? Those scales of yours are like the night sky." Midnight shifted, the blue patterns on its scales pulsing briefly. James couldn't tell if it understood, but the name felt right. Throughout the day, James tried to signal the Pathfinder with his damaged communicator. His leg wound had stopped bleeding, but walking remained painful. Midnight stayed nearby, occasionally disappearing into the forest only to return with more food, or, once, with a strange fruit that tasted like sweet honey. "Why are you helping me?" James wondered aloud. "Shouldn't you be eating me instead?" By the second day, James had worked out a system of basic communication with Midnight. A hand-raised palm out meant stop or no, while a circular motion meant come or yes. Surprisingly, Midnight seemed to grasp these concepts quickly. That evening, James heard the distant sound of engines. "My team," he exclaimed, trying to stand too quickly and reopening his wound. Midnight's reaction was unexpected. The creature moved to block the cave entrance, its scales darkening to near invisibility in the shadows. A low, vibrating sound emerged from its throat. "It's okay," James said, making the circular yes motion. "They're friends." Midnight remained tense but allowed James to move past. Outside, James could see searchlights sweeping the forest about a mile away. He fired his emergency flare into the sky. The lights changed direction, heading toward his position. Within minutes, a shuttle hovered above the ravine, its searchlight finding James on the ground below. But when the light crossed Midnight, chaos erupted. "Hostile creature, take it down," came a voice over a loudspeaker. "No," James shouted, throwing himself between Midnight and the shuttle. "Don't shoot, it's friendly." The shuttle's weapons remained trained on them as a rescue harness was lowered. James turned to Midnight, whose scales were now fully black with agitation, the blue patterns pulsing rapidly. "I need to go with them," James explained, using hand gestures to convey his meaning. "They're my kind, but I'll come back." Midnight seemed to understand, backing away slowly while keeping its eyes on the shuttle. As James was lifted into the air, he watched the magnificent creature fade into the forest like a shadow. On board the shuttle, the rescue team bombarded him with questions. "Was that what I think it was?" asked Bill, the security officer. "The locals call them shadow claws. They've killed 3 exploration teams in the nearby sectors." "This one saved my life," James replied firmly. "And I think there's more to them than we know." Back on the Pathfinder, medical scans revealed something strange in James's blood. Trace amounts of a compound similar to the unusual radiation they detected from orbit. "It's like nothing we've seen before," said Dr. Mike, studying the results. "And it seems to be changing your cellular structure in minor ways." James thought of Midnight and the food it had brought him. "I need to go back down there," he said. "There's something happening on this planet that we need to understand." Captain Thorne frowned. "Those creatures are apex predators. Reed, they've killed humans before." "Not this one," James insisted. "And I think I know why." "This is insanity," Captain Thorne said, pacing the Pathfinder's conference room. "You want to go back to that death trap of a planet because you think you made friends with the galaxy's most dangerous predator." James stood his ground. "Midnight could have killed me a dozen times. Instead, it protected me." The science team had spent 3 days analyzing the data from James's first encounter. The unusual radiation signature matched the bioluminescent patterns on Midnight's scales, suggesting some form of bioenergy that science had never documented before. "I'm going with him," Dr. Mike announced, surprising everyone. "These cellular changes in James need monitoring, and I want to see these shadow claws up close." Captain Thorne reluctantly approved a second mission with heavier security. The shuttle landed near the same ravine where James had first met Midnight. As they disembarked, James felt an odd tingling sensation at the base of his skull. "Midnight's nearby," he said confidently. Bill, the security chief, raised an eyebrow. "How could you possibly know that?" James couldn't explain it, but something had changed in him. He could feel a presence watching them from the dense forest. He walked forward, away from the group, ignoring their protests. "Midnight," he called. The forest remained still for a moment. Then a shadow separated from the trees. Midnight emerged, even more impressive in daylight. The security team raised their weapons, but James signaled them to hold fire. Midnight approached cautiously, those intelligent golden eyes shifting between James and the armed humans behind him. James raised his hand in greeting, making the circular yes motion they had established. To everyone's shock, Midnight mimicked the gesture with one of its 4 clawed hands. "It understands," Dr. Mike whispered in awe. Midnight made a series of clicking sounds, then gestured with a clawed hand for them to follow. James didn't hesitate, though the security team protested loudly. "This creature saved my life," James reminded them. "I trust it." They followed Midnight deeper into the forest, eventually reaching a massive clearing dotted with cave entrances carved into a cliff face. And there, to the humans' astonishment, were at least 20 more shadow claws of varying sizes. "It's a colony," Dr. Mike breathed, recording everything with his scanner. "A social structure." The other shadow claws reacted with obvious alarm at the sight of humans. Several moved protectively in front of smaller ones, clearly juveniles. Midnight made a complex series of clicks and rumbles, which seemed to calm the others slightly. "They're communicating," James said. "They have language." As they watched the interaction, James noticed something strange about the colony. Many of the shadow claws bore injuries: missing claws, scarred scales, damaged eye ridges. One was missing an entire arm. "Someone's been hunting them," Bill observed, his professional assessment cutting through his fear. Midnight approached one of the injured adults, making gentle clicking sounds. Then it turned to James and mimicked pulling a trigger with its claws. "It's trying to tell us something," James said. "I think they're being hunted." Dr. Mike's scanner beeped. "Look at this," he said, showing James a reading. "These creatures have extraordinarily high concentrations of that compound we found in your blood. Whatever it is, it's valuable." As if confirming their suspicions, a distant explosion shook the ground. The shadow claws became instantly alert, the juveniles rushing into the caves while the adults formed a defensive perimeter. Midnight grabbed James's arm, gentle enough not to harm him but firm enough to convey urgency. It pointed toward the sound, then made the pulling trigger motion again. "Hostile contact," shouted Bill as his scanner picked up approaching signals. Multiple vehicles, heavily armed. In that moment, James understood. "It's not the shadow claws we need to fear," he said. "Someone else is the real enemy here. And Midnight brought us here because they need our help." Captain Thorne's voice crackled over the communicator. "Read. We're detecting a large ship entering orbit. Unknown configuration, heavily armed. What the hell is going on down there?" The answer came as sleek, armored figures emerged from the forest, weapons raised. They weren't human. The armored figures advanced through the forest, their weapons glowing with an eerie purple light. They wore sleek helmets with multiple islets that gave them an insect-like appearance. James counted at least 12 of them. "Get down," Bill shouted, pulling James and Dr. Mike behind a fallen tree. Midnight and the other shadow claws melted into the surroundings, their scales shifting color to match the forest. 1 second they were visible. The next, they were merely shadows between trees. "Those must be the collectors," James whispered, remembering Midnight's warning gestures. The lead collector raised a hand, and the group halted. A voice emerged from its helmet, speaking in a strange language that seemed to consist mostly of clicks and whines. Then, to everyone's surprise, it switched to broken English. "We know humans here. Come out now. This not your business. Bill readied his weapon. What's the plan? Reed? James studied the situation. The collectors were well armed but didn't know exactly where they were. The shadow claws had vanished but were surely watching. He remembered the tingling sensation at the base of his skull. Focusing on that feeling, James tried to project a thought. We need to work together, The tingling intensified, and suddenly James could sense Midnight's presence to his left. Not see, sense. As if responding to his thought, Midnight's golden eyes appeared between two trees, followed by its massive form as the camouflage scales shifted back to their natural color. The shadow claw approached James, crouching low to avoid detection. It extended one clawed hand and gently touched James's forehead. The tingling exploded into something more, a crude form of communication. Not words exactly, but images and feelings rushed into James's mind. He saw collectors capturing shadow claws, harvesting something from their scales. The blue bioluminescent patterns being extracted while the creatures were still alive. Pain, fear, rage. They're farming them, James gasped, pulling away from the contact. Harvesting that compound we found. Dr. Mike looked horrified. Those injuries weren't from fighting. They're surgical. A collector weapon fired, the shot hitting a tree near their position. Last warning, humans. James looked at Midnight, then at his team. A plan formed in his mind. The shadow claws can sense our intentions, he explained quickly. That's why Midnight helped me. It could tell I meant no harm. And now, I think we can communicate with them. You want to fight those armed hunters with a bunch of animals? Bill asked incredulously. They're not animals, James corrected. They're intelligent beings being hunted to extinction. He turned to Midnight and spoke slowly, pointing at the collectors, then making fighting motions with his hands. Help us stop them. Together. Midnight's golden eyes blinked, and the blue patterns on its scales pulsed rapidly. It made a series of clicks that were echoed from various positions around the clearing, the other shadow claws responding. I'll take that as a yes, James said. He turned to Bill. Can you call for backup from the Pathfinder? Bill nodded, activating his communicator. Captain, we need immediate support. We got hostile aliens harvesting the native life forms. Captain Thorne's voice crackled back. We're detecting their ship moving to your position. Whatever you're doing, do it fast. James looked at Midnight. Let's show them what happens when you mess with our friends. What followed was a battle unlike any the humans had ever experienced. The shadow claws moved with incredible speed and precision, using their camouflage to appear and disappear around the collectors. The human team provided covering fire, while Midnight seemed to coordinate the shadow claw attacks through some silent communication. When three collectors cornered Dr. Mike, Midnight appeared from nowhere, its powerful claws slashing through their armor like paper. When a collector aimed at Midnight's back, James tackled it to the ground. The Pathfinder's security team arrived just as the last collectors retreated, disappearing into their transport vehicles and speeding away. That was incredible, Dr. Mike said, treating a minor wound on James's arm. The way you and Midnight coordinated. James watched as Midnight approached, its scales still rippling with excitement from the battle. It extended its hand again, and this time James didn't hesitate to make contact. The message was clearer now. Friends. Protect. Together. Yes, James agreed aloud. Together. Captain Thorne's voice interrupted the moment. Reed, the collector ship is preparing weapons. This isn't over yet. The Pathfinder trembled as the collector ship fired its first warning shot. Captain Thorne gripped the command chair, her knuckles white. Shields holding at 80%, reported the tactical officer. But we can't take many more hits like that. James stood on the bridge, having been urgently called back to the ship along with the ground team. Midnight and three other shadow claws had insisted on coming with them, a development that had the crew both fascinated and terrified. They're hailing us, said the communications officer. A harsh face appeared on the main screen, humanoid, but with pale gray skin and eyes with vertical pupils. The collector commander spoke in heavily accented English. "Humans, you interfere in legitimate business. This planet and its resources belong to the Vex Corporation by right of discovery." Midnight, standing beside James, let out a low growl. The bioluminescent patterns on its scales pulsed angrily. "You're harvesting sentient beings," James countered. "The Shadow Claws are intelligent." The collector laughed, a disturbing sound like breaking glass. "They are animals. Valuable animals, but nothing more. Their biology produces Luminex, the most powerful regenerative compound in the galaxy. One extraction from a mature specimen sells for more than your little ship is worth." Captain Thorne stepped forward. "We've documented their intelligence and social structures under Galactic Charter Section 12. That makes them a protected species. There is no documentation if you do not leave this system alive." The collector replied coldly. "You have 1 hour to surrender the specimens you took and depart. Otherwise, we will destroy your vessel." The screen went black. Dr. Mike, who had been monitoring the Shadow Claws, approached with his scanner. "James, you need to see this. The compound, Luminex, they called it. It's responding to emotional states. When Midnight gets agitated, the production increases." James looked at Midnight, whose golden eyes seemed to understand the danger they were in. The tingling sensation returned to James's skull as Midnight reached out one clawed hand. This time, the connection was stronger. James saw flashes of the planet's surface, underground cave systems, valleys, and what looked like abandoned ruins of some ancient civilization. "They're showing me places to hide," James told the others. "Places the collectors haven't found yet." Captain Thorne shook her head. "We can't outgun that ship, and UNSC reinforcements are weeks away. Our options are limited." "Then we don't fight their ship," James said, a plan forming. "We take the fight to the ground, where the Shadow Claws have the advantage." For the next 40 minutes, they developed a desperate strategy. The Pathfinder would appear to flee, drawing the collector ship away while leaving behind 2 shuttlecraft hidden in the planet's dense atmosphere. Meanwhile, James, Bill, and a small security team would remain planetside with the Shadow Claws to strike at the collector's ground operations. "This is beyond risky," Captain Thorne warned. "If you're captured." "We won't be," James said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Midnight's people know this planet better than anyone. As they prepared to execute the plan, Dr. Mike outfitted James with a neural amplifier. "This might strengthen your connection with Midnight. Based on my readings, there's a rudimentary telepathic field generated by those bioluminescent patterns." The moment James activated the amplifier, the connection with Midnight deepened dramatically. Not just images now, but concepts, plans, strategies flowed between them. "Hunt together came Midnight's thoughts. "Protect home The team deployed in the small shuttles, skimming just above the forest canopy to avoid detection. Above them, the Pathfinder engaged its engines and bolted from orbit, drawing pursuit from the collector vessel as planned. Landing near the Shadowclaw colony, James was startled to find nearly 50 of the creatures waiting for them. Midnight communicated their arrival, and the Shadowclaws had prepared for war. Through Midnight, James learned that the collectors had established a processing facility 10 miles north, a place where captured Shadowclaws were taken for Luminex extraction. Many never returned. "That's our target," James told his team. "We destroy their facility, and they lose their reason to stay." Bill checked his weapons. 6 humans and a bunch of overgrown lizards against a fortified collector base. "I like those odds." Midnight's scales rippled with what James now recognized as amusement. The great predator lowered itself to all 6 limbs, offering James its back. "I think I'm being offered a ride," James said with a grin. As the sun set, turning the forest dark, James mounted Midnight's powerful back. The other Shadowclaws fanned out around them, their scales shifting to near invisibility. Only their golden eyes gave them away, glowing briefly before they too vanished into the gathering darkness. The hunt had begun. The collector facility rose from the forest like an ugly metal scar. Harsh lights cut through the darkness, illuminating a perimeter lined with energy fences and guard towers. From their position on a nearby ridge, James and the team observed the compound through binoculars. "I count 20 guards at least," Bill whispered. "And those are just the ones we can see." Through his enhanced connection with Midnight, James sensed the Shadow Claw's rage as they both watched hover trucks arrive carrying cage-like containers. Inside were more Shadow Claws, their scales dull with fear and pain. "They're bringing in more for processing," James said, his voice tight with anger. The neural amplifier Dr. Mike had given him was working better than expected. James could now share complex ideas with Midnight, and through Midnight with the other Shadow Claws. They had developed a plan to disable the facility's power generators, free the captives, and destroy the processing equipment. As the team prepared to move out, James's communicator beeped with an encrypted message from Captain Thorne. "We've lost the collector ship," her voice crackled. "Repeat, they'd doubled back toward the planet. Expect reinforcements at the facility within 2 hours." "Copy that," James replied. "We're moving in now." But as he turned to give the signal, James felt a sharp pain in his side. Looking down, he saw the stun baton that had been pressed against him. Holding it was Lisa, one of the Pathfinder's junior officers. "I'm sorry, Reed," she said, her face cold. "But there's too much money at stake." James collapsed, his muscles seizing from the electrical charge. Through blurring vision, he saw 3 members of the team subduing Bill and the others. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. "The collectors paid you," he managed to say. Lisa nodded. "More than I'd make in 20 years with the UNSC. They just want their operation to continue. Nothing personal." James tried to warn Midnight through their connection, but the pain scrambled his thoughts. He felt the Shadow Claw's confusion and alarm in response. The traitors bound the loyal team members and began dragging them toward the facility. "The collectors will pay extra for you, Reed," Lisa said. "They're very interested in how you've bonded with these creatures." As they approached the perimeter fence, a sudden darkness fell over them. The guards' searchlights swung wildly, then went out one by one, accompanied by startled shouts and the sound of tearing metal. "What's happening?" Lisa demanded, drawing her weapon. The darkness seemed to move, flowing like liquid shadow. Golden eyes appeared all around them, more than they had ever seen before. Dozens of Shadow Claws emerged from perfect camouflage, completely surrounding them. Midnight appeared directly in front of Lisa, its massive form rising to full height, scales pulsing with blue fury. Before she could fire, one powerful arm knocked the weapon away while another gripped her throat, lifting her off the ground. "Midnight." "No," James called out, struggling against his bonds. The great predator turned those intelligent eyes toward James, questioning. Through their connection, James felt Midnight's desire for vengeance against the one who had hurt its friend. "Not like them," James projected. "We're better than them." Midnight held Lisa for a moment longer, then dropped her roughly to the ground. The other traitorous crew members were quickly subdued by Shadow Claws. Bill, now freed by one of the smaller Shadow Claws, helped James to his feet. "I thought we were goners. How did they know?" James touched the neural amplifier. "I think our connection is stronger than we realized." Midnight sensed my distress and brought reinforcements. He looked at the gathering of Shadow Claws with new appreciation. A lot of reinforcements. The facility's alarms began blaring as guards noticed the commotion at the perimeter. At the same time, James's communicator crackled with an urgent message from the Pathfinder. "Reed, the collector ship has entered orbit and is deploying ground forces. You have minutes at most." Midnight approached James, touching its forehead to his, in what had become their way of strengthening their mental connection. Through the link, James saw a new plan forming, not just a raid now, but a full-scale assault. Images flowed into his mind. Hundreds more shadow claws emerging from hidden caves and tunnels all across the region, moving to surround the facility. They had been gathering in secret, called by midnight through some silent communication network that spanned the planet. An army of the galaxy's most lethal predators, united for the first time in their history, ready to reclaim their world. Change of plans, James told his team, a fierce grin spreading across his face. We're not just sabotaging this facility anymore. We're taking it over. 3 months had passed since the battle at the Collector facility. What had begun as a desperate assault had turned into a pivotal moment in galactic history. James stood on the observation deck of the UNSC diplomatic vessel Concord, watching the blue-green planet rotate slowly below. Still hard to believe all this started with you getting lost in the woods, Captain Thorne said, joining him at the viewport. James smiled. Sometimes the best discoveries happen by accident. The battle had been fierce but decisive. The Shadow Claws, led by Midnight, had overwhelmed the Collector forces with sheer numbers and coordination that no one had thought possible from a species previously dismissed as mere animals. James and his team had managed to capture the facility's communication array intact, broadcasting evidence of the Collector's illegal harvesting operation directly to the Galactic Council. The images of Shadow Claws being cut open, while still alive for their Luminex, had shocked the civilized worlds. When the Collector reinforcements arrived, they found themselves facing not only an army of Shadow Claws, but also 3 UNSC cruisers that had responded to the Pathfinder's distress call. Ambassador Reed, called a young officer. They're ready for you in the conference room. James nodded, straightening his new formal uniform. The title still felt strange to him. After the Galactic Council had declared the Shadow Claws an intelligent species with full rights, they had needed someone to represent human interests in the new relationship. James had been the obvious choice. In the conference room, representatives from 12 species sat around a large table. At the far end, Midnight waited patiently, now adorned with ceremonial markings painted on its scales. 2 other Shadow Claws stood nearby, their golden eyes taking in everything. The neural amplifiers had been refined, allowing for clearer communication. Scientists had discovered that the Shadow Claws had always possessed a form of telepathic ability, using it to coordinate hunts and share information across vast distances. Now, with technology bridging the gap, true dialogue was possible. We gather today to finalize the Protected Species Accord, announced the Galactic Council chairperson. For the first time, the Shadow Claws, or the Lumen as they call themselves, will have representation in galactic affairs. James approached the table, feeling Midnight's familiar presence in his mind. Their connection had grown stronger with time, a bond that transcended species. Through Midnight, James had learned the rich history of the Lumen. Their art, their songs, their profound understanding of their world's ecosystem. Humanity is honored to serve as advocates for the Lumen while they establish their own diplomatic course. James began, addressing the council. What happened on this planet must never be repeated. No species should be exploited for resources, no matter how valuable. Midnight stepped forward, placing one clawed hand on a data pad specially designed for their anatomy. The room fell silent as the great predator formally signed the accord, marking the Lumen's entry into the galactic community. The tingling sensation in James's mind formed into clear thoughts. Asterisk, we were alone. Now we are not. Your kind and mine. Different paths, same journey, asterisk. The UNSC has established a permanent research outpost on the planet. With the Lumen's blessing, James continued. Together, we're exploring ethical ways to synthesize Luminex without harm. The medical benefits could save millions of lives across the galaxy. After the ceremony, James and Midnight walked alone along a cliffside overlooking the vast forest that had become home to them both. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, reflecting off Midnight's scales in dazzling patterns. You know, when I first saw you, I thought I was going to die, James said aloud, though he knew Midnight could feel his thoughts. Midnight scales rippled with what James now recognized as laughter. Asterisk thought you looked too small to be dangerous, too fragile to eat asterisk. Lucky for me, James chuckled. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear. Other humans and Lumen had begun forming bonds similar to theirs, though none quite as strong. Scientists, diplomats, and explorers were learning from each other, two intelligent species discovering new possibilities together. Asterisk, what will happen next? Asterisk Midnight asked through their connection. James smiled, placing his hand on the massive shoulder of the creature that had once been considered the galaxy's most lethal predator, and was now his closest friend. We'll find out together, he replied. That's what friends do. As darkness fell, the bioluminescent patterns on Midnight scales began to glow softly, joined by distant points of blue light throughout the forest as other Lumen began their evening communications. James felt the gentle hum of their thoughts. Curious, peaceful, and no longer alone in the universe. The end was really just the beginning.